We're moving into the third official panel for today's Munich exchange, with a few small changes to the lineup. Paula Nascimento unfortunately couldn't be with us because she has engagements elsewhere and conflict in her travel schedule. And Jean Chaltal also could not be with us today, unfortunately, but he does send his warmest regards. However, for the next discussion topic, which is called Prototype Design as Critical Intervention, what I would like to propose is we explore the question of how architecture and urban research can serve as critical interventions in our urban environments. In this session, I'm going to ask our panelists Ilze Wolff, Doreen Adengo, Will Monteith, Patti Anahory, and César Schofield to reflect on the process of defining their own conception of mobility and the specific opportunities and challenges that they encountered during the preparation for the exhibition on African mobilities. I also have the supreme privilege of introducing Ilze Wolff, whom I, by virtue of just shaking in my shoes and being incredibly nervous yesterday, forgot to thank at the exhibition opening. And what I should mention, there's a far more extensive biography of Ilze in our brochure, but Ilze Wolff co-directs Wolff Architects with her husband, Heinrich Wolff, and she's also the co-founder of Open House Architecture, a research practice that documents and reflects on Southern African architecture in Cape Town. In addition to that, she was the recipient of the 2016 International Al Irma C. Prize in Rome for her published dissertation, Unstitching Rex True Form, the story of a vacant modernist clothing factory in Cape Town, that tells a very complicated and entangled story about the multiple histories of modernism and modernity in a city like Cape Town. And she has numerous academic highlights that include co-teaching a 2013 summer studio at the Università Louvre de Venezia in Venice, and addressing both the Charles Correa Foundation in Goa and the Architecture Practice and the City panel discussion at Columbia University quite recently. The work of Wolff Architects has been exhibited internationally in venues such as the Venice Biennale, the Museum of Modern Art, in New York, Louisiana Museum of Modern Art in Denmark, Bi-City Biennale of Urbanism, Architecture in Shenzhen. And she has numerous publications and talks in collaboration with artists and scholars as part of their ongoing practice at Wolff Architects in an attempt to develop an enduring public culture around city, space, and personhood. Please help me in welcoming Ilze Wolff.
Thank you, Mpo, for the wonderful introduction. Thank you to TUM, Andres and Teresa for hosting this wonderful discussion. Last night I had a discussion with Lekan about Mpo's role in this whole production, and I feel like Mpo was like the conductor that sort of just pulled together this incredible symphony of people, symphony of artists, and we were just there to be guided by Mpo as the curator. So I think let's just celebrate that for a moment. I mean, it was incredible. We've been working for months on this project, and it's just amazing to see everybody here and under this incredible vision. So I've been fangirling Mpo since day one. So for me just to be talking about this project is incredible. So what I wanted to just talk about briefly is what is design, and can design be a conversation? And with this project on African mobilities, it was a very important conversation between ourselves. I'm one of a design duo myself. Heinrich is over there, part of the practice, and part of a conversation in our studio, part of a conversation with Mpo, the curator, about this project, and in part a conversation with the public. So, can we start? Okay. So what I'd like to just quickly show is it not? Oh, there we go. So is a transcript of the conversation that we had about this project. We had a design conversation over Skype, myself and Paul, Maria, the project architect, Teresa and Andres, shortly after we conceptualized the formal strategies around this exhibition, because it was very important for us to conceptualize this exhibition or this part of the exhibition as a moment along various moments of African mobilities. The exhibition in our mind was already unfolding as we were talking through the exchanges, through the various city dialogues, and through the various partnerships that were set up by Mpo. So for us, the Munich exchange, the kind of formal intervention in the gallery was a kind of a moment of delay, a moment of pause in this unfolding mobility, this unfolding very mobile exhibition. So we recorded you guys, and I transcribed the entire conversation around how we'd like to think about it. And we were thinking about how do we interpret the curatorial strategy, which was about thinking of this exhibition as unfolding, and thinking about African mobilities as an interdisciplinary, transnational, research-driven project, and thinking about it as a world in motion. The themes, we immersed ourselves in the kind of thinking around the themes and the content arrangement, and then thinking around how do we begin to visualize our interpretation of the curatorial statement through sort of just looking at all the participants and how they present themselves online, how they present their work, how we can then begin to formalize an architectural strategy. This was the conceptual drawing that we presented to the mobilities team, African mobilities team, which was a conflation and a collage of a series of models, a series of geometric explorations, and a series of light studies that we were thinking through based on the interpretation of the curatorial statement. We then began with a kind of a diagram, thinking about what is the content, how does the content then begin to be kind of appropriated into these follies, into these spaces. And we discovered that a lot of the content was driven by video. Sound was a huge element in this project. The library became a key space for us to think through this moment of delay, and how do we think about just a museum as a hangout space, a gallery as a hangout space, which was for us quite a radical thing to think about. And so one of the ideas that I was playing around with is how do we delay that moment of scanning an exhibition. And it's something that I'm still trying to figure out, because a lot of the time you go to an exhibition and it takes you about a minute and a half or 5 minutes just to scan the content, and you walk through a big space. And I really wanted to delay that experience, and we wanted to work through what would it take to actually get people to sit and relax and listen to music, listen to some of the amazing content, and watch movies and read books. In a way, this was also a key diagram in terms of how do we begin to interpret the various overlaps in the content, because even though there were these very discrete themes, speculative, cartographies, prototype, many of the content actually overlapped in very important ways. And we needed to think about that very carefully, where they then begin to overlap in the three halls of the space. So Paul very gladly says, "I love this diagram," in the conversation, and that became a key sort of thinking about even the geometries of the exhibition. We were thinking very carefully through how do we domesticate the space, whether we got there I'm not sure, but we were very interested in how can we transform a gallery space into a kind of a domestic sphere through plants, through lighting, through soft surfaces. And one of the one of the projects that really kind of motivated that idea was Paula Nascimento's project, Beyond Entropy, about Angolan landscape. And the idea was to have landscape in the museum, to think about domestication and about the natural environment. And then another issue was around thinking about light, color, light intensity, geometries. Geometries in terms of its, we have pure geometries, circles, triangles, rectangles, but how do we begin to shift it a little bit, just twist it around a little bit to just make it look a little bit different, and then begin to make us see things differently. And the idea of layering became very important. So the idea of taking very hard surfaces like timber, layering it with muslin, fabric, became a very important way of thinking through this idea of shifting geometries in space and playfully distorting the gallery space as well. So these are just some key images around how we began to think about the geometries. Trying to set up some of the ideas around light as well. And then the one issue that we also thought is that how do we actually think of this exhibition as not as an end, not as a kind of a finished idea, that you come to the third space and it's done, and we go home and we have our dinner and we don't engage further. So the idea of like the curved wall in the last room and the kind of lit up shifted or twisted circle is to really think about, this is a conversation, but the conversation needs to carry on, needs to be open-ended, you need to think beyond the museum, beyond the gallery, and to think about our interventions as an ongoing conversation. This is just one of the conceptual models, thinking about display. How do we think about displaying, not necessarily on the walls and maybe different planes. So yeah, I mean, it's a very nuanced project. It's a very smartly visioned curatorial statement. And the idea of bringing various people together to have very important conversations around race, around representativity, around mobility, and the kind of nuances around mobility, around African mobility and creative exchanges was something that we really just wanted to pay homage to and think with all the participants and particularly the curatorial team. Thank you.
Thank you, Ilze. Up next we have another research team from Kampala and the UK, Doreen Adengo and Will Monteith. So I'm going to start by introducing Doreen Adengo, who runs her own architecture practice in Kampala called Adengo Architects. And she focuses on architecture and urbanism practice grounded in research and multidisciplinary collaboration. Recent projects for Doreen have focused on researching the housing crisis in Kampala and trying to develop affordable housing solutions. After completing her undergraduate and graduate studies at the Catholic University of America and Yale respectively, she worked in London, Washington, D.C. and New York for Ajaya Architects, Robert Stern Architects, and Ellerb Beckett. and Grisman Samtan architects. She has taught at the New School and Pratt Institute in New York and at Makerere University in Kampala. Doreen is currently a part-time lecturer at Makerere University's intern training program, and a visiting critic at the University of Johannesburg Graduate School of Architecture. William Monteith is a lecturer in the School of Geography at Queen Mary University in London, where he convenes a course entitled Urbanization and Development in Sub-Saharan Africa. An interdisciplinary social scientist by training, he has a BSc in Geography and an MA in Politics from Newcastle University, and a PhD from the School of International Development at the University of East Anglia. William has been conducting ethnographic research in Kampala's marketplaces over the past 5 years. He's currently working with the Urban Action Lab at Makerere University on a project mapping the activities and experiences of refugees in urban markets in Kampala, funded by the UK's Department of International Development, DFID. Please join me in welcoming both Doreen and William.
Thank you for the introduction. So our project is an interdisciplinary collaboration between architecture and geography. We're looking at ways in which African migrants and their enterprise actively transform the socio-economic and built environment in Kampala. So as Mpo mentioned, I'm an architect practicing in Kampala, and I met Will about 4 years ago while he was starting his PhD in Kampala, looking at markets, the largest one, which is Nakasero Market. And I remember thinking, as he described his project, it would be very interesting to do an architecture project about the issues that he was looking at, which was about the socio and economic structure within the markets. And we're really grateful that this African Mobilities has given us a platform to do this. So we're going to start by Will explaining what his research was and how it fed into what we eventually did. And then I'll talk about the architecture part of it. So without further ado, Will will come up and speak about his part of the research.
Thanks. Okay. So why am I, as a white, male, British geographer, at an architectural exhibition on African mobilities in Germany? A good question, right? To which the short answer is, like many other people in the room, I'm fascinated by, and in certain ways in love with, urban marketplaces, hanging out in them, trying to understand them, and thinking about the ways in which people situated within different marketplaces around the world, several of which I've been living in and working with over the last 6-7 years, most recently in Kampala, how people interact in markets and use markets in ways that are generative of new urban compositions, right? So what is it about marketplaces and the groups of people, products, goods, materials that they bring together? The diverse groups that they bring together. What is it about that process of kind of assemblage that is generative of new urbanisms, but also new urban economies, new urban socialities, new ways of coexisting and living within diverse urban worlds? And so if we think of the urban as the city, particularly the city of Kampala, as a kind of form of intensification, then for me, the marketplace is in many ways the embodiment of the urban, right? As a kind of a process of intensification and spatial concentration of diverse bodies, diverse products, diverse materials, right? That are generative of compositions well beyond that which we often see and encounter as we walk through places like Nakasero. And so I'm interested, inspired by the work of Edgar Peterson and Abdul Malik Simone, by the idea of markets as sites of urban redescription, right? As sites of experimentation, which people come together under fairly uncertain, often indeterminate, and fairly provisional circumstances, often just for a day or two at a time, and assemble something new, make something new. And what do all these assemblages add up to? What can they tell us about cities? How can they remake and reimagine cities beyond the borders of the market itself? And so, really, this project and a lot of my research is kind of starts from a kind of hopeful position, which is whilst being mindful of the kind of historical structural forces that have shaped places like Nakasero, a quintessential British colonial marketplace, is to think about marketplaces from a starting position which doesn't see them simply as products of structural forces, right? Of modes of kind of capital accumulation, colonialism, neocolonialism, etc., but places which are actively reimagining and reworking these structures, right? Through these kind of everyday practices. What happens when that's the starting point for these kind of questions and these kind of debates? So I spent 2 years doing ethnographic fieldwork in this particular market here in Kampala. An interesting place insofar as it is kind of a quintessential colonial institution, as I hinted to. So established by the British colonial administration in 1927 to provide a livelihood for 300 indentured Indian laborers and kind of who are the emergent commercial classes in Kampala, as in many other urban African settings in the early colonial period. So a place established and very heavily kind of regulated, both in terms of the form of the built environment and the kind of endless modes of governance that were enforced on the urban environment in the colonial era, for about 300 indentured Indian spice vendors, now provides a livelihood to over 10,000 people from across Uganda and the broader region. Right? And the emphasis of our project and our kind of starting point for this project is the broader region and the ways in which people from the broader region are interacting within this space. And so it's thinking about the market as a place of arrival. Right? The central marketplace, often symbolically situated within the center of the city, as often the first place that so-called newcomers, new arrivals in the urban environment, come as they seek access to information, resources, shelter, livelihood, and in the case of Nakasero, also medicine and food, which is provided in the market itself. And so in what ways are these interactions, particularly by people crossing international borders, the focus of this project, and the ways in which they move in and around the market, in what ways are these kind of challenging and reimagining some of the kind of structural features of the market that were put in place by the colonial administration? And so if we're thinking about markets as sites of arrival, we should also mention Uganda as a country of arrival, particularly in the last few years. So according to UNHCR, currently hosts over 1.3 million refugees. And we can talk a little bit in the discussion section around the utility of this word refugee and the various baggage it has attached to it, and some of the difficulties we had in the project ourselves, just deciding upon a kind of conceptual language with which to describe the mobilities we were seeing. Just suffice to say that this figure, what I find interesting about this figure, is that it's precisely the same figure as the total number of asylum claims in Europe, in the European Union, in the so-called refugee crisis of 2015. So the very same number of people, the whole of the European Union in the crisis of 2015, are currently resident in Uganda. And the ways in which this kind of equivalency raises debates around the ways in which certain spaces and certain mobilities are featured and documented in the international press, and other types of mobilities and other types of kind of accommodation are not featured or featured in a very different way. Yeah. How many people live in Uganda? About 40 million people. Yeah. 1.3 million in a country of, I think, about 41, 42 million people, to put that in context. So quite an astounding number. Okay. So one of these, the most kind of prevalent of these populations is the Congolese population in Kampala, right? Which we chose to look at in more detail. I'll get to that in 1 second. And the ways in which, because the starting point, markets as sites of arrival, the ways in which we started this project was rather than following the Congolese as they move around Kampala. I mean, we noticed that the ways in which different groups were interacting with the city was often mediated through different materials, different goods. In the case of the Congolese population, it was wax fabrics, chitenge in Uganda, Boko. And so rather than following the population, following the so-called refugees, as is conventionally done in kind of journalism and much research, we decided to start by following the chitenge, following the fabric as it makes its way around the city, and thinking about the compositions and interactions that take place at each stage at which the fabric is moved and traded. And so it's worth emphasizing that these kind of connectivities facilitated by the movement of wax fabric have a certain history and a certain geography that goes back to the colonial era. That starts in Java, in Indonesia. So this kind of batik method of creating and processing fabric, printing fabric, which is then exported back to Europe, appropriated by the Dutch colonial enterprise and administration. But on this journey back to Europe, it stops in West African ports, where there's a literature that argues that essentially, at this point, wax fabric, Javanese wax fabric, becomes African wax fabric. These styles, these patterns, these methods are reappropriated by particularly female market vendors in West Africa, and combined and kind of reimagined through a diverse range, a diverse kind of tapestry of West African cultural practices, symbols, colors, etc., and then transported across the continent. And arriving, interestingly, through the continent, moving through the continent east, and arriving in Uganda through the Congolese population, right? So this migration of Congolese refugees into Uganda over the last few years coincides with the transportation of this fabric. So the Congolese population become the vehicle through which this good enters Uganda. So thinking about the material also as a form of communication, it's important. And so there is a number of stories you can tell about these kind of journeys, these kind of geographies, and one of which is kind of a story about the ways in which colonial organizations have kind of reappropriated and kind of commercialized this kind of Africanness, or this kind of brand Africa within wax fabric. So Vlisco Corporation, for example. Always be wary of companies that kind of proudly declare that they were established in 1846. But the story we wanted to tell here, so we deliberately, these are all very interesting and valid stories, but the story we wanted to tell here in this project doesn't begin with Vlisco, doesn't begin in Holland, but begins really through protagonists in Kampala, in these markets, trading and moving around with this material, wax fabric. So with that, I'll hand over to Doreen.
Okay, so with that background, I'm going to explain how we worked. So this is a whole team. The top row is all the architects. It's not a coincidence that they're all women, and it wasn't by choice. It's just a reflection of the context within which I'm working. You see many different countries, 4 in total. So we were communicating across country and also across disciplines. And also within the architects, I studied in the US. Priscilla studied at Makerere University in Uganda. Nina is currently in Berlin Technical University. And then Randy is at Cambridge in the UK. You must have met Nina and Randy yesterday. So even amongst us, our trainings were different, and having to communicate across that was very interesting and led to very good results. William is clearly not an architect, and so we had to take his information that was written and translate it into drawings. And so there's a lot of communication that had to happen, and we're very heavily reliant on internet. So one of the challenges that we came across, because we're using Dropbox, WhatsApp, WeTransfer, 3 days before the big deadline, Vodafone Uganda went out of business. And they didn't inform anyone. Yeah, I didn't mention this, because I thought you wouldn't believe me. They didn't inform anyone. At that point, Nina had actually come to Uganda and had given her one of those MiFis. And so she says, my MiFi is not working. I was like, well, just come to the office and use the office internet. And then suddenly the office internet's not working. And then one by one, everyone realizes, because it was the biggest company, that they were going out of business but didn't want to declare it publicly. So suddenly, I had to buy a whole new internet package in order to hand in all the drawings in time. And that's something none of us could have predicted. And so the point I would like to make with that is that if I was still based in New York, it would have been much cheaper and much quicker to finish everything. But the fact that we were in a context where the infrastructure is not as stable meant it took twice as long and it was twice as expensive to get things done in time. But besides that, we really pushed to get everything in time, and everyone's really enthusiastic. And we'd all from the beginning wanted to come to the exhibition, so I'm glad that we were able to. The next point I would make is about Joel and Dave, who are the two video editor guys that we had. We realized halfway through the process that because there's no video school officially in Kampala, they were actually not formally trained. They kind of learned along the way. And so we had to quickly find a solution, and that's how Zahir came in from South Africa, who I met through UJ and through Leslie. And Zahir came in at a point where we'd gathered all the information, and he asked two key questions, which were really good. One question is, what is Kitenge? And he was honestly asking what it was because he didn't know. But he said, to make this video, you have to explain what is Kitenge, and then why, as an architect, are you interested in this protagonist? Because we found this one person to tell the story about Kitenge in the market. And so we had to sit amongst ourselves, like regroup for 2 weeks, and answer those two questions. Why are we interested in this? Why are we following this person? Why are we doing this in the first place? I should say collaboration. I want to make it sound very rosy, but it was a lot of arguments, but good arguments, to come to a clear story that is authentic and that tells the story of the person in the market and not a story of what we imagine their story is. And so I think one other thing I'd like to say about this is the way that each of us met. So as I mentioned, I met William 4 years ago when he was starting his PhD. Randy is also looking at markets, and so when she Googled, I guess a year ago, she found William's work. Then William put Randy in touch with me. Nina I met because she came on a German program 2 years ago. And Zahir I met through Leslie. So there's a lot of connections that happened very informally to bring this whole team together. And what's interesting about that is that's the same process that we saw in the market, in the way that people rely on each other and connections that are made and how people do things. So I'll explain how we started, which was with Kampala Exchange, which feels like so long ago, but it was last August. This was a workshop where we're looking very closely at markets and trying to understand how to represent temporary conditions which happen within these environments, because you can't use a conventional plan section elevation. So how do you document exchange? And what was interesting about this workshop, you see both Nina and Randy were in there. This is when they met for the first time. There were students from Makerere University and other universities within Kampala. And one of the things that was interesting for the Ugandan students is they didn't think there was anything interesting in their own environment to study. So that was their first time. They were going to a market, which they had always known, to study it as architects. And that was very empowering for them. This is a protagonist that we found. Elvis is a Kitenge trader in downtown Kampala. I'm now going to briefly show you the video, which will tell you the whole story about now I need the German view, full screen. It's basically where all our different training, whether it's drawing, photography, script writing, all came together. Yes. Is the sound on?
Called Elvis Asalembe. I'm a Congolese by nationality, and I sell Kitenge. Kitenge is a fabric made out of cotton with an African print on it or any African idea.
Kitenge is truly a global artifact.
Called Elvis Asalembe. I'm a Congolese by nationality, and I sell Kitenge. Kitenge is a fabric made out of cotton with an African print on it or any African idea.
Kitenge is truly a global artifact, once produced in Indonesia, Holland, West Africa, and now increasingly China. But it isn't just a fabric. To many Africans, it's a symbol of independence and of influence.
In 2011, that's when I moved from Goma, where I was born, to Kampala. I moved because of civil war going on in my country. Yeah, it forced me and my family together to move up to Kampala.
After arriving in Uganda as a refugee, the Kitenge trade provided Elvis with an opportunity.
We Congolese, we are good at selling Kitenge. We are born in Kitenge society.
In order to maximize profits, many building owners in downtown Kampala tried to squeeze as many shops as possible into their buildings. As a result, most shops fit into a 3 by 3 meter space. Elvis's shop, however, was originally designed as a storage closet. It's even smaller, measuring 3 by 1 meters. By having fold-out counters, Elvis has expanded his space to the standard 3 by 3 meters.
When I wanted to make different shelves in my shop there, I considered the size of the fabric because I wanted to have many shelves so that I may display all the fabrics properly on the shelves. So I told the carpenter to measure a fabric and to make for me shelves according to the size of the fabric. That's how my shelves are a little bit squeezed.
The shelves are multifunctional. They serve not only as a display area, but also as a storage space and as a colorful attraction for his shop. The fabrics are arranged according to quality. There's a lot happening within the shop, with designated areas for the customer, salesperson, and pedestrians. To many, this tight space might seem like it's not enough. However, by meticulously maximizing every inch of the space, Elvis makes it work. Kitenge fabrics have made their way to the global fashion industry.
Back in the day, kitenge was something maybe your mom would wear or your grandma would wear. It was never anything that anyone young would even consider wearing. Things that were considered traditional are trending now, but I feel even before that, it was an international trend on internationally recognized catwalks. There's this movement about being proud of our heritage.
The Kitenge trade has enabled the Congolese community in Kampala to challenge the dominant representations of refugees as victims by exerting an influence over the urban fashion and culture.
The more I sell materials, the more I also get ideas of different prints also. In the future, I think I'll be also going to the factory and place my own order so that I may also get in big quantity. In 5 years, I think I'll be having a very big shop.
Elvis's work in the Kitenge trade provides an example of ways in which the refugee enterprise is actively transforming the social, cultural, and built environment in cities such as Kampala, and at the same time, forging connections to the global economy. All this in 3 by 3 meters. So that was the video, and I'll go back to, the full screen. Okay. So that was a video that pretty much brings together all the work that we did. And I'll end with talking about the impact that working in African mobilities has had in Kampala. Because of the relationship I built with the Goethe Institute, the unit I'm teaching at UJ, which is what Leslie was talking about earlier. So I'm teaching a unit that's Unit 15. We're looking at Kampala and specifically at the wetlands and what kind of temporal conditions are happening in there. And just before the UJ students were coming to Kampala for an exchange with Makerere, we realized that Makerere had no space. So I approached the Goethe and said, can we do another workshop? It will be very similar. This one is a bit longer, but it was pretty much the same idea. We worked on drawings, went to the site, had presentations, and again, this exchange between 2 different countries and getting the local students exposed to different ways of thinking is something that came out of this particular workshop that could have only happened because the Goethe provided their space. The other impact it's had is on training. So this is Joel, the photographer I'd mentioned earlier, whose background is very different from a Makerere student who's in university and well-educated. Joel, we found out, because he then worked on the UJ project, was so much better, because he'd learned a lot from African mobilities. Joel is from one of the informal settlements, and his family is actually originally from South Sudan and had moved eventually to Kampala. And he'd gotten into photography by being a guide for different researchers like Will or myself, or the UJ students that came into his neighborhood. And so through being a guide and then learning about photography and taking this workshop here, that workshop here, he kind of pieced it together. So it's still a work in progress, but I think that one thing that initiative like this can have is really focus on training. It's very easy to fly people in who already have the skills. It's more difficult to train locals, but I think it's really important to think about that aspect of things, because there needs to be a capacity locally. And I'll end with this slide, which is the UJ students going to Elvis. So I'm going back to Elvis now, let's say 6 months later, and I see that he's actually added more shells in the kind of top left corner. And we showed him the video, and his only comment is, because we'd interviewed him so many times and asked him so many questions, and we had to go back once the here kind of made the story much clearer, he expected a whole feature. He was expecting a 3-hour video. He couldn't believe after all that. And so, on a serious note, I think that what's happening downtown Kampala is different from uptown Kampala. What building owners do is they submit plans that look like uptown Kampala, knowing that they're going to change them and make them much smaller. And what the town planners should do is really speak to the users, people like Elvis, hear their story and how they're using their space, and probably change the way the whole planning approvals process is working, and kind of understand exactly what amount of space is needed and why, instead of this kind of disconnect between the plan that's submitted and then exactly what's happening in the space. And I think I'm out of time, so I'll end with that. Thank you.
Thank you very much, Doreen and Wolff, for sharing your reflections on both Kampala Exchange and also the process that developed as a result of some of those conversations, some that preceded and some that followed it. For the final pair of panelists, I'd like to introduce Patti Anahory and César Schofield Cardoso, who work as the dynamic duo from Cape Verde and were our very generous and dynamic hosts for Prior Exchange. That was probably a marathon 3-day art and architecture festival in Cape Verde that involved an incredible number of people from across the entire, or several islands, and various institutions as well. So by way of brief introduction, Patti Anahory is an architect and a designer with a master's in architecture from Princeton University and an undergraduate degree in architecture from Boston Architectural College. In 2000, she became the second woman in 113 years to win the prestigious Roche Traveling Scholarship and the first winner of the design competition to travel sub-Saharan Africa. From 2009 to 2012, she served as the founding director for CID-LOT, an emerging multidisciplinary applied research center at the University of Cape Verde, which addresses dynamics of settlement, urban growth, and development. In 2011, she co-founded Jus Collective, an interdisciplinary arts collective, now a professional practice to promote a critical understanding of the urban dynamics, architecture, environmental, and intermedia studies. Anahory's latest collaborations with filmmaker and web developer César Schofield Cardoso are Storia No Lugar, Ungrounding Narratives, a platform for participatory media and mapping projects developed through direct engagement with communities in marginalized contexts, and parenthesis, a space for creative experimentation and cross-disciplinary dialogue. César Schofield Cardoso was born in Mindelo in Cape Verde Islands. He works in photography, film, and media art. In 2006, he launched Praia MOV, an urban culture movement in Cape Verde city of Praia, in collaboration with architects, artists, and other critical thinkers, which has since marked his creative production around the issues of citizenship, justice, urban space, and identities. As a web programmer, he has combined online platforms, image, and sound. He is the creator and author of the blog beyonderblogspot.com and co-founder of the Black Cinema Itinerant Forum and Storia No Lugar. From 2012 to 2016, he has been the coordinator of the development of cinema and media art of Cape Verde Ministry of Culture. Please join me in welcoming César and Patti.
Thank you, Mpo. Thank you for inviting us to participate in this amazing experience. And thank you, Andres. Thank you, everyone, for being here.
Can you please talk in the mic?
Okay, I'll do that. Okay, I'll try to speak louder. I was thanking Mpo, Andres, and everyone for being here and for inviting us and including us in this amazing discussion. So, as Mpo has already mentioned, we come from Cabo Verde, the only islands represented here in this exchange. Oh, in New York, sorry. New York is a country. New York is a country. Hey, Brooklyn is not an island, but anyway. But in the African continent. Oh, that's right. Sorry, my bad. 25 years in the US and I didn't get it right. Apologies. Anyway, so we are going to, what we've been addressing in our work, and that has been also challenging a lot, is how to think from an island perspective and how to contribute to this greater discourse from this perspective. And we know that islands are spaces or fluctuating spaces where endogenous and exogenous narratives are always constructing and restricting it and shrinking it. So this is something that interests us a lot, and the narratives that define or this island narrative. So Cabo Verde has been, and throughout history, since the slave trade, obviously, a space of a lot of flux and movement, forced, desired, imagined, right? So it's kind of a quintessential crossroads in the Atlantic world, and which has been shaping these narratives about this space and issues of identity. So these are all issues that interest us a lot. And then also in terms of geopolitics and how these forces are shaping our current contemporary spaces. So here we are showing just some provocative images. Here is about cocaine in West Africa, and so these crossroads are also from very illicit trade from migration, and so on and so forth. So we're right in the center of many of these issues. Here we're also showing how also our special partnerships with the European Union and the fishing agreements are affecting in many ways the social, economic landscape of our islands. And also trade we started to look at trade, and it's something that interests us a lot, especially for African mobilities, gave us this opportunity to really look at these kind of geopolitics of where we are, import, export, immigration, and the key players in this have obviously been our former colonizer, Portugal, the European Union, even though our proximity to the African continent is incredibly short, or we are very distant from it in many ways. So these are a lot of the issues that personally worry us, and we discuss it a lot. And a few years ago, César and I decided to do something about this somehow, of a more personal level, but also in terms of our practice, and to really question these narratives that are binding us in this kind of geo-referenced landscape, and to propose other narratives, or how we could come together, me as an architect and him as a visual artist, filmmaker, and how can we begin to conceive of a way of practicing that would allow us to propose other narratives and other cartographies about the space that we are caught inside. So what we have now as a common project, in addition to our own work, are two spaces that we are trying to develop. One is called Parentheses, which is actually a physical space, and the one that received prior exchange. So that's how we engaged with prior exchange, and how prior exchange really, Amo helped promote it also as a space for critical thinking and dialogue and collaboration. And the other project is Storia no Lugar, that is an online platform. So, and Storia no Lugar, let's say officially, is the one that's preparing this response to the challenge of the exhibition. So these are the spaces that we're trying to develop in Cabo Verde to address these issues of, at multiple scales of geopolitics, urbanity, identity. Okay. He's claiming I should speak. So African mobilities gave us the opportunity to look at these issues of geopolitics. Specifically, we chose the issue of trade and the numbers that we didn't show, but very poignant numbers about the relationship of Cabo Verde to the European Union, to China, and to the major key players that are shaping this kind of economic landscape of Cabo Verde. And specifically, we chose to look at the circulation of products and how they could speak about mobilities and about people, but starting from the lens of products. And more specifically, Cape Verde is also, for those who don't know, we're 10 islands, a population of approximately 500,000. The capital city, Praia, is about 130,000 people. But we also have a very huge diaspora, mostly in the United States. So it's been a country defined by its diaspora. It's guesstimated that we have about 1 million Cape Verdeans outside of Cape Verde. When we started to look at these products, we started to look specifically at the shipping barrel, which is a ubiquitous element in all of Cape Verde. And we wanted to talk a bit about the relationship to the diaspora, because these shipping barrels were sent as remittances initially to families who are in the United States, would fill it with goods, used goods, food stuff, and send it to their families as aid. But then it started becoming unclear where was the remittances landscape of these barrels and the landscape of used clothing sale, which we are yet to unravel and to really find out where the one begins and the other ends. But anyway, just to give you numbers, and this is also, again, our interest in geopolitics and the global trade brought us to the used clothing phenomenon, because throughout the city, and we'll show some pictures, throughout the city you see a lot of traders using these containers, the shipping barrels full of used clothing to sell. It's interesting because recently in the last month, Africa has been, or some countries in Africa have been kind of head-to-head with Trump, with the AGOA agreement, over the used clothing imports, because it's affecting a lot of the textile industries in East Africa. And East Africa imports about $151 million of used clothing from the United States. And it's trying to change that by taxing the import higher. But anyway, so Kenya is considered the country that imports more used clothing in Africa, but they forgot Cape Verde. If we look at it from a per capita equation, you know, we actually import more kilos of used clothing per person than Kenya with its 100,000 tons. Even though in Cabo Verde there's only 3.1 tons, it really has an impact. And we'll see it has an impact in our city. It has an impact in many ways. Just go back a little bit. Anyway, so this also, we use the terminology. In Cabo Verde, we call it yeah, like, you know, yeah, man, you know, like the American expression, because they know that it comes from the US. So it's like, I'm wearing yeah, by the way. I made a point of going to yeah to buy you, to wear for this as a little performance. César was not very happy about the very flashy pants, but I thought it was so appropriate. So my pants, my top, my jacket is from Ya. But not, oh, and then the prices. Anyway, so then I also did my own tracing back of these products that I bought, looking at the internet and trying to find out when they were produced and how long it took to get to Cabo Verde or to get to my hands. And you know, these 7 for All Mankind were, you know, on Amazon in 2015. This one I couldn't find because it's not a designer, and my jacket is still on Amazon for $200, but I bought it for $10, and my pants for $8, even though it was a 7 for All Mankind $295 pants. So anyway, so there's, I mean, this is just to talk about how it's also kind of subversive to bring it back to Germany, because because in the used clothing, the global used clothing, the biggest exporters of used clothing are the US, UK, and Germany. So anyway, so let's move on. So initially, as I had mentioned, we started looking at the bidons, as we call them, from bidonville. Whoever speaks French or who knows, the bidon is this kind of barrel, right? Metal barrel, from which you then produce panels for so-called bidonvilles, you know. But anyway, so when we started looking at them, most of them still have the addresses of the sender. So the immigrant family sending it back to Cabo Verde. And we also did this kind of Google search of all the addresses that we found in all the barrels. So there's a lot of kind of networks in these other cartographies, which we're not showing here, but which we did to understand all these networks of connections. It's incredible. It has the address, and in Google you could see the picture and even see somebody in the porch, and the front porch. So it's quite interesting, this idea of being able to trace back these products and these objects to the sender. And the interesting thing is that they're no longer necessarily used by the families. Now somebody else has it and they'll write their name on it. So there's this kind of layering of names and ownership and which is very interesting to us. And then here we're just going to show a slideshow of this phenomenon that happens throughout the city. There's different types. There are the spaces that are being created by the municipality to accommodate part of this, and there's a lot of complaints about that. And then there's just myriad people at different corners, and we started mapping those throughout the city, selling it, just opening the barrels and putting it out on the street for sale. And these are just some examples. And this is all used clothing, used shoes. I didn't buy used shoes. So makeshift racks and shading. And then this is actually the official market, Sucupira, where there's definitely more infrastructure, if you could call it, but you could see how densely these products are densely packed in the market, and then also on the street. And there are this different types of traders. We started mapping them. There are those who, it was also interesting that these people, these traders have these bidons with the names either family members or they've traded them with other traders, but many of them have never been outside of Cape Verde. Most of them haven't been outside of Cape Verde, but have this imaginary of immigration. Some of them go every year to buy used clothing and bring back, used and new, in the United States, mostly to the Brockton, New England area. That's where the biggest Cape Verdean community is. So here we started mapping within 1 square kilometer of our office the different sales in the streets and of the bidon, of the used clothing, of the clothing throughout the city.
We found 55 points of sale.
Yeah, so in about a kilometer square, we found about 55 sellers. It could, we haven't had, we're trying to get kind of an idea of we know it, we see it, we know it's a lot, but we're trying to get kind of a number and the spatial relationship to the city. And also, of course, we already have some readings about how this happens in some neighborhoods but not in others. So as we go on with this research, we'll be able to map other kind of cartographies and other stories about it. Go back. And also, what is very interesting is that there's this whole system of rolling the bidons in the morning, because these ladies obviously cannot carry these heavy bidons. So there's this network of young men who, from 5:30 in the morning, go and take it out of storage, whatever the storage is a rented space or there's various types of storage spaces, and then they roll them to the sale point, and then they roll them back at the end of the day. So we are also kind of mapping this other activity that's invisible to most of us. And until we started looking at this, even though we see clothes being sold every day in many street corners, we hadn't found out about this network of young men who make a living from this rolling back and forth of the bidons. Anyway, he speaks, so now he's going to speak.
Thank you. I just want to add some more information about this platform that we are creating, is in the process of creating it. I will try to show just this is our first pilot that we did in a neighborhood near home, and why we are creating this platform. Sorry, I must open my notes. You must forgive my English is not so good, so I will read my notes. the reason why we are creating or trying to put together this platform is we need to tackle several issues related to our practice, and we are facing various challenges. For example, how to combine different worlds. That is, how to combine different ways of thinking, from artists to researchers to the community we work with, and to the policy makers. And how to make this combination visible for all different worlds with the same level of clarity. We have some other challenges, for example, how to deal with the lack of institutional support and the lack of resources, how to share our work, how to make it part of a broader thinking. Myself, I'm a photographer. I do photography and video, but I'm also a web developer. And after several years working with IT and specifically with web technologies, I know that it doesn't solve things just by using it, but the recent iteration of it, the second generation of web technologies, seems to offer good opportunities. It is truly multimedia. It can host video, audio, all kind of content. It is platform we can showcase in a exhibition like we are doing here, or in the web or mobile phones, etc. The network bandwidth is improving greatly in the world, even though in our countries is still a debate. The internet access. The tools like mobile phones are really amazing. It's an opportunity for us to. And in the documentary filmmaking field, there is a new approach. The web documentary or web docs is what we are trying to create. Each new project is a web doc. It's a new story. For example, AMO is it's a story that we are trying to put together. So we have this pilot, and the next web doc will be AMO. We are working on some more 2 stories, and yes. So we are proposing a platform where we can work around these several challenges and opportunities, a platform for collaboration and showcasing different works, a platform that can put us together. Thank you.
Thank you very much, Patti and César. Please, can you join us at the front? Ilze, Doreen, Will. Do you want to join us at the front, Andres? Do you want to join us at the front? Yeah, go ahead. You need a chair, though. Yeah. Well, give us an image. Give us the bidon with the...
Which one?
The one I like. Yeah, that's the one. I don't think that it's necessarily a coincidence that the final or the almost final panel, speaking panel for African mobilities focuses so explicitly on design, questions of design intervention, but also questions around curatorial practices across the African continent and the way in which our varied contexts make certain demands on us that we couldn't possibly have anticipated at the beginning of the project. So I mean, I really appreciated you sharing the process and also like some of the difficulties that you faced while trying to produce content for African mobilities. And I think that it's also a productive way to maybe have a conversation about what next, right? Like how do we do it better, and what do you think could have enriched or will enrich or strengthen the work that you're doing from your various locations? And I felt that it was really important to have Andres be part of this conversation too, because it's been a learning curve for both the Architecture Museum and me at Wits University to actually understand how different environments function and what kind of infrastructures are and are not available and what they do and don't make possible. So I thought that, for instance, your conversation around like internet access, whether you're in Cape Verde or in Kampala or at Wits University, continues to be like a huge challenge. And like even though Ilze and I are only about 2 hours apart, it wasn't always easy to maintain contact. So these spaces of delay are not just a sort of like clever conceptual device. It's actually a kind of like, it's real. It's real. So we just have to be very efficient in between like spaces of sort of dead time. But I was just hoping that maybe because, you know, César and Patti were hosts and Doreen was a host in Kampala, and it's a taxing. It was a huge ask, right? It was a huge ask from our collaborators, and you guys completely stepped in and took it to the next level. So I'm very curious to know what you think could be the next step. Maybe not even for African mobilities, but what is the next step for you in your own practice? It would be great if we could do something together, but you know.
I think what is very important now on is documentation and make all this available to the public, to our countries, to the community that we work with, because most of the time we are doing great things, but then we can't share it. So I think now on, the challenge, at least for us, and we work, this is our one of our values, is to give back what we are doing. So for me, the challenge now is to make it available to the public.
Yeah, I will pick up on the fact that we are independent and we try to create an independent practice, and the challenges that presents in our context. For us, because there are two things that I would point out, among others, are creating a public and collaborators, and finding collaborators within our small context of Cape Verde. I'm speaking specifically within Cape Verde boundaries, and that's why we try to break away from that, and we try to create this platform that is online so that it could bring together collaborations and sharing. But also when you try to do critical work and you are independent, you're in your own practice, it's very hard. You're not an academic. I'm no longer in academia. We have our own independent practice, and when you're not institutionalized, as I say, it's hard to even make collaborations across countries. You know, I mean, I'm very grateful that this format of African mobilities allows different artists and architects to collaborate in this discussion, and academics and non-academics. But when you're on your own, the ground is shaky. So perhaps it'll be interesting also to keep working on with independent practices and how they're trying to fashion a critical thinking practice, and see how we could promote more of these cross institutional or cross discussions.
So yeah, the question is what's next, right? I don't know. But I think that there's something very important about design as pedagogy, and the space of African mobilities was that exact intervention of design as the beginning of a conversation. I spoke a little bit about how design and form and architecture is a kind of a culmination of various conversations between you and your accomplice, you and your collaborators, you and people in the studio. And I think this project was a way of holding a whole series of conversations. And how do we then just continue to do that? I think the curatorial team and Paul and you were kind of very aware of all these conversations that were happening in the continent, which I think is an amazing way of holding it then in the space, through this project. And I think we just got to keep doing that. I don't know. Yeah.
Yeah, I'd agree. I think the most important thing about this is the dialogue, and especially the workshop was this platform that allowed different disciplines, different groups of students to come together, and everyone wants another workshop, that's that's another thing. And for us to be able to do it with the UJ students was also really powerful. Within Uganda, a lot of the young people use WhatsApp in a very different way. It's not just for texting, it's the way they're sharing notes, they're sharing images, they're sharing videos. I think that one way to get the information out is through videos. I learned the power of video through working on this project. Unfortunately, we learned as we were working. I think I would definitely, we're making another video with the UJ students, and I think that would be really interesting. But I think if there's a way to make the video compressed enough and then sent through WhatsApp, that has the information that we're working on, that's one thing. A book is always much stronger because it's like a physical thing that people have. And then we have the internet issue, and so the website, you know what I mean? So I think a way to continue the dialogue, especially for the people that feel isolated, and we all feel isolated. Like William was in the UK, Nina in Germany, and so this brought us together in a way that was empowering for us. But even the local students feel isolated. They have access to Instagram. They can tell other schools are doing different things, and how come they're left out. And so this workshop was an opportunity for them to connect to this world that they only see on their phone. So the workshops are really powerful. And I think in our case, if there's a way to continue the workshops, I think that would be a really good thing. Yeah.
I don't have much to add, just to, let's represent books. I like books. More books. More books. Yeah, books, yeah. Yeah, but it's relevant to those questions of infrastructure and the question of giving back, and how each platform, each technology includes and excludes different groups, right? So think about how we can diversify these outputs. So we've got the physical exhibition, we've all seen how fantastic it is. We've got the website coming, also fantastic, going to reach a whole new audience. What other outputs can we produce to reach other additional audiences? How can we diversify those outputs? Books, one of those. Thanks.
No, I totally agree with the books, but let me just give some additional remarks on the general. I mean, the exhibition was from the beginning, when you came up with the idea of mobilities, it was a statement about mobilities. It became a statement with mobilities that we produced through that exhibition. I mean, the series of workshops and exchanges that you have organized made people move around a lot and made ideas move around and exchange ideas. And I think this ideas now manifests in a way in that exhibition and with this exchange that we have here now. And I think that's now the momentum, the dynamic that we have with this exchange that we have here today with all these really wonderful designers, geographers, architects, theater people. Like, I think we would need this to take this dynamic now and transform it into like on the next to the next level of exchange. And I feel, as Doreen also said with the workshops, I also did workshops not related to that exhibition but to others, and I feel this is a kind of a very good instrument, and especially if it goes towards an exhibition, because then it's a manifestation at the end of something. I mean, I'm saying that as a curator and as a museum director, because I feel students, when they are engaged in an exhibition, the workshop has a real output, and it's not just a model that goes to the garbage at the end of semester. So even though they might not build something real, but there's an exhibition that transforms their ideas into a visual statement that has that gets access to just a broader audience than just the academic audience. And I mean, I just want to say that loud here. I mean, this is my kind of my mission statement for the museum, that I want to open up all these discussions to a broader audience, so that these kind of statements go also out, not only within these intellectual communities and to connect these academic circles that we are sitting in here in this university, but also that it goes out to a broader audience, and that it makes it understandable that what we are talking about is relevant for the future, and that I think exhibitions can have a great input and output both. And I think that's why I also would say the African mobilities should move on now on various levels that we described here. And maybe the most welcome from my point of view would be another exhibition in Africa, wherever, on an island or on a continent, wherever. So maybe this is kind of what's next from my point of view.
Have any comments related to this panel or to earlier discussions that you might want to raise before we have our jam session a little later? Ngoni.
It's a question for the architects. Did it change something in your practice, the way you think, the way you, because architects, you always work with also other people, let's say just to build the buildings. So you're used to working with other people, but you're in charge. It's your project. So you're on the construction side, bussing everybody around. And here it's a different, well, I've been there, so let's be honest. So here I'm interested to know what, because I understand the impact it had on the participants. I want to know what impact it had on you as architects in your practice. Maybe it didn't have any impact.
Are there any other questions? Ikem?
I know that there was a split, actually, if we consider all the panels in some sense, between workshops or exchanges that were held in academic settings and those that were held in non-academic, or in Doreen's case, I think it was at the Goethe, from the images you sent. And I'm sort of interested in what that experience was like. I was at the Lagos Exchange, and it was interesting observing the dynamic between African mobilities coming in, as it were, from the outside to a local institution and encountering certain forms of, resistance in that context. And my question is really whether you're in an academic institution or not, to what degree did you have to deal with some forms of local resistance to even the ideas that you were putting forth, which in many contexts would still be considered quite, I don't know, revolutionary might even be the term.
Okay, I'll answer ECAMS and then I'm still thinking about your answer. Well, we held it in our space, our independent space, but we also collaborated with the university. But we sought out that collaboration, but not with the architecture schools, because this dialogue, this type of discourse and question and critical thinking within the architecture field in Cabo Verde is non-existent. So we've made a choice of engaging with the Department of Governance and in the social sciences. So who with Odair, who's a sociologist and a political scientist, because it's someone we have engaged in these various questions. And he has a master's in regional integration body of students who are dealing with issues of identity and governance and cities. So he's very interested in this dialogue. Even though we invited the architecture students, it was no surprise to me that none of the architecture departments, we have two in the city of Praia, showed up, because it's just not happening. It's not happening. They're not our interlocutores in that sense. We tried. So yes, we looked for different types of partnerships, and we did look for the university, mostly in terms of this searching for discussion with people who are addressing critically a lot of aspects about our cities, about Africa. So that was our choice. But also it reflected, even though we invited, no one showed up from the architecture departments.
Yeah, my experience was similar. So with Kampala Exchange Workshop, none of the architects showed up, except the one German architect working in Kampala. And that's because they didn't understand what it was, but the students were very enthusiastic. And then the second workshop with the UJ students, all the architects showed up because it was longer. So after the third day, they heard about it and they came to find out what was going on. So from Makerere University and also the other university. But what's interesting, in the kind of social setting, they got into arguments with each other over just like old issues they've been having over whatever. And so I think it's better to remain independent. That's what I've learned. And so the Goethe Institute becomes this independent place. For some reason in Kampala, everybody knows Alliance Française, but nobody knows the Goethe, and they're actually in the same building. And so if you say we're having a workshop at the Goethe, people don't know what that actually means. And so then it just becomes this neutral place where you can have the workshop. And so that's the advantage, I think, of not, if you're with one school, then you're against the other school. There's all kinds of politics which you don't get involved with if you're with a neutral institution. And then the one about the impact, I hadn't stopped to think about it, but if I was to think carefully, I think I realize the importance of training. That's why I keep bringing it up. And that if I hire someone from the local university, there is a certain time within which I have to train them in a specific way that I wouldn't have to if let's say Nina came from Berlin. But it is important to train the local students, one, because they'll stay longer, and I think they'll have a larger impact because they'll remain in the environment longer. And so I think I've become more patient about understanding that when I meet someone, I need to understand, are they willing to learn, which is kind of what happened with the photographer. Are they willing to take criticism and willing to learn and willing to stay on the job longer? Because another issue that we have is young people wanting to move from one job to the other, and not very structured environment. And so I guess I'm still thinking about the answer to that question, but it's just realizing that I'm in a context where the graduates need to be trained in a specific way after they leave school, because they don't get that in school. And I'm learning what that is, and just learning that I should be more patient in getting that. Like getting them to a specific point. Yeah, I wonder if that makes sense.
So we didn't host an exchange, but I do want to add something to that that whole series of exchanges that unfolded in front of me on my phone, on Instagram, that I was so it was so seductive, those images of being part of a workshop, being part of a conversation, traveling as a place, you know, gathering key research that will end up in an exhibition, and so those images that I saw online influenced the design completely, you know, in terms of how we then present the work, how we present the work in this forum, and to come to your question, Gone, about the impact, is that exactly that. It was sort of, normally you would get a brief, you know, and the brief is very stable, and you know, and then you must, you know, formulate some kind of, you know, design out of this brief that your client has given you. But for us, the brief was unfolding the whole time while we were through the process and through the conversations, through the visuals, and I think it presented a kind of a freedom also, you know, because you're not so anxious about, you know, some stable brief, some stable expectation, and also I think the other freedom that we experienced was the fact that the brief was formulated by somebody that had the same disciplinary background, you know. Mpo was an architect, trained architect, so in a way it was a key collaboration, a disciplinary collaboration with that point that we don't often have the opportunity to explore the potential of those, you know, working with other architects to produce something like this. Yeah, so that was two big freedoms that this project presented to us. Yeah, thanks.
Okay. Do we have any other? Yeah, I have to get. You're gonna have to meet me halfway.
Thanks for this very inspiring panel talks, and it gives a lot of food for thought. I know Africa is big, it's not a country, it's actually a continent. It's very interesting actually, the people who leave the West or any part of the world and decide to relocate back home or live in between Africa and other spaces, and decide to engage in their own way with, you know, how to implement change or address certain frustrating thing that's happening back home. And things are cyclical. I'm sure our uncles, aunties, parents also felt that way. And I'm very curious to see how in different, because that panel is very interesting because it's you come from different part of Africa. I'm very interested to see how this generation who back in the days had to fight, had to endure dictatorship, had to endure all sort of transformation, and also are the product of 1968. We're celebrating the 50th anniversary. How much they're helpful, how much they understand. Is there a clash of idea? And in what you do, can you see also like some foundation into what they did? Because we don't live out of the void. And with regard to architecture and all this practice, what are the challenge? And yeah, that's my question for any of you.
Did you wanna respond? Or is somebody from the audience want to respond? Because it's, you know, I'd like to also open the conversation up to the floor as well, if anybody from the floor wants to add anything.
I'm still waiting for my answer.
Ah.
No, you answer. I have an answer. Patti and Doreen. Still waiting.
Are you talking specifically about African mobilities? This experience, how it changed my practice?
Did it change your practice? Maybe it didn't.
Well, I don't know if it changed it. I don't know if it changed it, but maybe it strengthened some conviction that that we are on the right path, you know, that these questions are important, that people want to know and what we are doing and what we are thinking about these issues. I think in that sense it didn't change, but it felt empowering to know that in our practice, whether we're architects, I mean, we also do buildings, I think all of us here, or the three of us, but that we also have this need to keep questioning our how our practice can have an impact in our context, but also in these kind of broader discussions. So I would say it didn't change, but it definitely was an empowering and reinforced that desire and that need to engage in these critical discussions. The challenge is, that we also, the three of us also have an architectural conventional practice, if we could call it that way, of making buildings and having clients who are not interested in these kind of discussions. So that's the ongoing struggle. How do you maintain the two and help inform each other and not be such a split personality kind of practice, which is in my case most of the time.
And I could answer actually more directly. I think that it made me more confident because we actually did manage to accomplish something. We started with so many questions and, can we actually do this? And then it actually got done and we managed to handle everything in time. And I realized that that we're capable of being able to pull a project together. It also sharpened my business sense because at the end of the day, we're running businesses. And so I was approached again by the Goethe, actually, because they want to do a workshop on this, the African modernism. I saw the book downstairs with Martin, it's a German architect? Yes, Manuel, yes. And so they want a Uganda chapter, and so they approached me and saying we should do the workshop to find the buildings. I said, okay, before we even start, let's first understand how long this is going to take me and how much it's going to cost you. Because now I can say that confidently, And I think that's the biggest impact, actually, to kind of understand, yes, we are doing good work, but it is a business, and there shouldn't be anything wrong with that. I'm kind of against the NGO model and doing work for free, but somehow you're kind of always made to think if you're dealing with refugees and vulnerable populations, and suddenly if you're talking about money, there's something wrong with it. But I think that it shouldn't be the case, and basically I've just learned that I should stand up for my worth because the work is going to be good. And I think just kind of coming to that conclusion, I think has been very empowering for me in that way.
But I would also respectfully, perhaps rhetorically, push back and against the idea of practice, architecture, creative practices being always a business. I just feel this responsibility to push back. Not that I have a never-ending romance for 1968, though I do think that 1968 is a significant footnote that we should absolutely always keep our eyes on. Though I know that 1968, if replicated in 2018, is a failure. So that said, I wonder about outside the system of money making, how a practice, perhaps closer to Leslie's Zulu term of magicians of space, can actually begin to happen. I'm fascinated when you mentioned, well, a number of things. The real difficulties of things taking twice as long and costing twice as much. I understand that this is very, very real, but at the same time, I hear a glimmer of possibility and potential when I hear statements that WhatsApp is somehow used and exploited much more and better than we do here. And there I think that there's some potential for a kind of way post 1968 possibilities and activism in creative work, a kind of perhaps non-materiality. As architects, are we really engaged in creating buildings, or are we engaged in creating space and forming it and so on? So I don't really have a question per se, but I felt the necessity to push back against anchoring ourselves that it's always a business to contend with. I don't say that I have any answers whatsoever, because I also have bills to pay. Oh.
Yeah. No, I want to maybe push back a little bit. And my dear friend. No. But I think Doreen's point is about getting paid. Yeah. And it's not exactly because you have to pay the bills. And I do think that historically, within architecture in particular, is that when one thinks about doing work for black or brown bodies, for people, there's a sense in the architect's mind, which has always been traditionally a white European practice of architecture, not building, because people have built around the world, but architecture as a trajectory that's now universal, that describes building around the world, is that sense that this work is pro bono work, right? And what you contribute to that is free. Our intellectual labor is free. And I do think precisely the point is, no, our intellectual labor and our physical labor is not free. And I do think there's a problem within architecture. The bohemian problem is like, oh, I just do this work, and even within the profession is that we do get underpaid. We know we work long hours and we don't get the money. But that's because often within the field, people had other sources of money, that they could draw on, that meant that, oh yeah, well those low fees don't really matter because I can still live well. I mean, that's the veil of the profession and more in general. Thomas Jefferson's a perfect example of that. He could be an architect because he had land and he had wealth, right, in that regard. And I do think that comes as part and parcel of architecture being a wealthy white man's profession. I just describe it as that these days. And that makes it hard for black people to enter in to the profession, precisely because of that. But that's also within the art world, that's also within the museum world. There's a whole lot of privilege that comes with that. So it makes it difficult to see then black people within those disciplines, because you can't get paid enough to pay rent and pay off that very expensive education. So that we've all got.
But can architecture and architecture practice be one's side gig?
Yeah, I mean, that goes back to Leslie's earlier point, is that I think we've crafted all of these hybrid practices in order to be able to do that and engage within architecture, but in very non-traditional ways.
As somebody who's had conversations with artists, researchers, and practitioners across the continent, I think one of the key misconceptions or assumptions that I made was that because I'm institutionalized, I can, that I can actually discount to a large extent the amount of time that I have to put in to the project because I'm subsidized in some way. And one of the biggest challenges, like I'm fully in support of working with like small autonomous institutions, but it also raises very serious questions around sustainability. And I don't think that that's something that we've actually thought through or resolved. And I think it's a conversation that needs to happen on both sides, like people who are running practices or small autonomous institutions, whether it's worth their while to participate in projects like this. And so I don't have answers to it, but we had this conversation last year where I was just like, oh my God, okay, so I had to there's nothing in the way that I understood the world or that I understood how institutions across Africa operate or how they don't pay or do pay that would have prepared me for some of the challenges that and some of the demands that African Mobility's made on our regional collaborators, that there were a whole set of assumptions that I made about the kinds of support that they have access to and the amount of privilege that they might have that in fact is not true. So I think that this has also been a huge learning learning curve for me too, in terms of just not assuming that that resources and assets are evenly distributed, even across the continent and between different countries, and actually developing more intelligence, or at least sensitivity towards navigating that kind of stuff. Because not everybody can afford to do pro bono work, nor should they be asked to, especially in a context.
People ask me to write for free. I say no, and they get angry. So I accept to be the mean girl. I don't work for free. Never. So slave drivers, stay away from me.
So I just wanted to say something, I think a little footnote in response to the question of 68. And it goes back to something that Alvin Boyarsky said, I think, in 1973, which was only 5 years later.
Seriously? Yes. People were born after 68, you never heard it? Who never heard
Student.
In Germany, of course they did.
Student revolution, student protests, student movement, yeah. 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 So, in response to that, a little bit, 5 years later, Boyarsky made the statement that he was fond of looking for talent in the Architectural Association, giving it a teaching job, putting on an exhibition, and then later seeing that exhibition come out of the ground. And that was a reference to the importance of the exhibition as the fermenting ground for building. And for me, it's a really interesting role for the exhibition. That's it.
Okay, thank you very much. I think that ties it up quite nicely, and we don't all leave feeling that we've been completely exploited by the whole exhibition industrial machine. So as I mentioned earlier, we do have a listening session in the Chimurenga Library at the Architekturmuseum from 5 to 7. Drinks might be served if you arrive on time. And I hope that you'll join us there and bring your friends too. But I'm sure Andres has some words in closing for the session that he'd like to make. But again, just thank you for an incredible morning and afternoon of conversation. And I hope that the platform grows, the networks get stronger, the book gets published, the web series gets documented, and that African Mobilities and all of its seedlings continue to flourish and grow. So thank you again, Andres, and everybody who came.
I mean, there's not much more to be said. I think we all thank you, Mpo, for organizing it, and I also want to thank Teresa in the back that she kind of made that happen together with Tondarai and all the other part of the team to really get this going and make it visible also here and record it so that we get the message out, also make this information mobile from Munich to the rest of the world, to all islands and continents. So I think that's the important message, and I hope we all can continue these conversations, these exchanges from now on, and hopefully you will lead that in the future, because now we have these networks that we can build on, and I hope you all spread the message that we really want to continue with the exhibition and the exchanges. Thank you all.